everyone and welcome to the Institute for Government. We're going to make a start. I'm Jo Caseborn. I'm a Programme Director here at the Institute and I lead our work on public services, of which markets is a key part of that. I'd like to start by thanking the Business Services Association for partnering with us on this event series. And this is actually the second event in a series of 4, and more about the next one at the end. And would like to particularly welcome BSA and their members to the Institute today. In terms of housekeeping, there's no fire alarm scheduled for today, so if it does go off, please do follow myself and colleagues out down the main stairs that you came in. And please do tweet, the hashtag is up there, it's PS Markets for Public Service Markets. So before we get going, just a few thoughts on why we think this is an important event series to be having. Well, back in September, the Prime Minister set out his vision for a smarter state in a key speech in which he talked about reform and efficiency as well as devolution as his 3 key principles for a smarter state. And as part of that, he talked about the government bringing in new providers, allowing new ways of doing things, paying providers by the results that they achieve, and opening up contracts to small businesses to help drive innovation. We also saw some key changes announced in the spending review last week. For instance, expanding the support for social impact bonds, introducing a new work and health programme after the current work programme and work choice contracts end, as well as joint commissioning for employment support between the Mayor and the boroughs in London. So some key changes afoot. So what we want to explore in today's event is what these new models of public service markets might look like. And our panel are going to be particularly exploring how new ways of integration and collaboration in markets can help government to shape a smarter state. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panellists. First of all, Christine Chang, who leads Big Society Capital's public service markets work. Christine sits on the boards of Social Investment Scotland's Social Growth Fund, Pact Futures and Thera Trust, and the Credit Committee for the RBS Social and Community Capital. Next up, Chris Blackwell, who's Managing Director of Maximus UK's Welfare to Work business. He previously worked at Ingeus as Chief Operating Officer and then Deputy Chief Executive. And Chris is on the Board of Directors of URSA, the Employment Related Services Association, as well as being on the BSA's, chairing the BSA's Welfare Committee. Sarah Billiard, who's Managing Director of Collaborate. Sarah joined Collaborate after working as CEO of Kent Probation. And before that, she was a senior civil servant in the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit. And last but not least, Richard Johnson was Chief Executive of Work Directions UK, now Ingeus, and then ran Serco's Welfare to Work business. And Richard is currently a senior consultant for the World Bank and also chair of 3 social impact bonds targeting at-risk young people. So in terms of the format for today's event, I've asked each of the panellists to speak for 8 minutes, and I shall be ruthless with time so that we have lots of time for discussion and debate, because we have a really interesting audience gathered here today. Many of you have a great deal of expertise in these areas, and we'd like to hear from you as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Christine first.
Thanks a lot, Jo, and I wanted to thank the Institute for Government and the BSA for hosting these discussions, because in this environment where there needs to be more delivered for less, I think it's imperative that the public sector, social sector and the private sector work collaboratively to deliver and meet society's needs. To give you a bit of background about Big Society Capital, we were set up to grow the social investment marketplace in the UK so that charities and social enterprises can access appropriate finance to enable them to grow and deliver more social impact. Since we launched in 2012, we've invested over £160 million. And alongside that, we also act as market champions for charities and social enterprises and for government to see how they can leverage social investment to deliver the work that they need to. I lead our work, as Jo said, in public service markets, which means finding ways that our capital can be used to support charities and social enterprises to deliver more and better in public services. So we saw the logic of bringing together the strategic value add of the corporate sector alongside the value add of the social sector. And we launched a corporate challenge prize at the end of last year called the Business Impact Challenge. And it was really offering up to £15 million of match investment to corporates to engage them in this debate about social investment. And an exciting initiative between Interserve and Catch-22 emerged from that. So Interserve, FTSE 250 public service provider, Catch-22, a £55 million turnover social enterprise. And really, in recognition of the fact that public services need to be delivered in a new way, they've decided to form a new joint venture. And really, it's about building the capacity of charities and social enterprises to deliver, bid for and deliver in public service contracts. And we can see the real value that both of these two organizations bring to the partnership. For example, the joint venture is going to bring and draw upon the knowledge of Interserve in procuring IT services, as well as leverage the huge economies of scale that they achieve in IT procurement processes. Also, Catch-22 will bring their knowledge of social impact measurement to share with the sector. And the joint venture is expected to have equal ownership, and I think this is really important, across the social sector and the private sector. And I'm pleased to announce that we've announced today that Interserve and Catch-22, this partnership, has actually been selected as the winner of the Challenge Prize by the Business Impact Challenge panel. And that's precisely because they could see the potential for transformation through this partnership. However, I would note that there are things that government commissioners need to do to create a more level playing field for charities and social enterprises in public service markets, and actually more broadly than just charities and social enterprises, SMEs as well. I spent last year working, and Sarah will know this, working with charities and social enterprises bidding in MOJ's Transforming Rehabilitation Program. And out of 21 contract package areas, only one social sector-led consortium is actually delivering, when actually, in fact, I would argue that a host of credible social sector organizations bid in the program. And I think there are some key takeaways that we can apply across government procurement processes that hopefully alleviate some of those. Firstly, if commissioners have minimum requirements around financial health, so balance sheet, turnover, then they should be really clear about that as early as possible in the program so that organizations aren't spending lots of time, quite precious time and resource in bidding for these contracts. Secondly, considering the balance of price versus quality in the evaluation of bids, because it's much easier to differentiate on the basis of price than it is on quality. Also considering, for government, setting a standardized price, which then providers are saying what you can deliver for that price so that we prevent a race to the bottom. And thirdly, and lastly, rethinking the role of guarantees. And government is increasingly asking for guarantees in procurement processes, which large organizations like Interserve find it much easier to deliver than smaller charities. And it's really for government to think about the risk transfer that they're able to get through asking for guarantees and weighing that against the consideration around other value for money objectives, so things like market plurality and ultimately outcomes. And so really it's considering whether there are alternative incentives to guard against bad faith bids, for example, exclusions from future contracts. And again, I would urge government to publish the terms of any guarantee requirements early so that bidders who can't meet those and can't fathomably meet those requirements don't spend time and resource bidding. In DWP's Health and Work program that was announced in the recent spending review, which is to take the place of work program and work choice, the support needs of the hard to reach, really around a supportive environment, long-term advisor relationships, connections with local communities, and access to integrated services are really at the essence of what the social sector can deliver. And it would therefore seem sensible to maximize the potential of the sector to deliver in that program. So that's all I had. I think I'm within the time.
Thanks very much, Christine. That's really interesting. On to Chris next.
So I guess, Joe, you mentioned the Health and Work Programme. Christine, you talked about the Health and Work Programme as well. I thought I would share a few observations in terms of the Health and Work Programme. So the Work Programme has been criticised pretty roundly in terms of its performance for the hard-to-help customers, and I think the Health and Work Programme is a reaction to that. And one of the criticisms has been, for those who are very hardest to help, we need to integrate services at a local level, and we need to ensure that people at the local level who understand local needs really help shape those programmes. And so the Health and Work Programme is part of the solution to that. I was at a workshop on Thursday with a group of people, local authority chief execs, directors of public health, and the topic really was, okay, so if we now get co-commissioning, and if you get co-commissioning of the Health and Work Programme, how do you use that? What power does it give you? What do you want to do with it? And I thought it'd be useful just to share a few observations, because is co-commissioning a panacea to all of the issues? And so the theory goes, if you get somebody who's highly disadvantaged, maybe with a health condition or disability, at a local level, maybe they're in receipt of employment support allowance, maybe been out of work for 5 years, that person will be accessing primary healthcare services, possibly secondary healthcare services, maybe accessing mental health services, housing services locally. There may be issues with social care as well. There may be a draw on those services. And it seems to make perfect sense that actually, if all of these services which are delivered locally, that you bring work into that. And the conversation on Thursday was, well, actually, you've got what you asked for, potentially. And it was very interesting to see how quickly the conversation dropped from commissioning to, well, actually, how can you make it work in reality, and what are some of the challenges of that? One of the interesting comments which came from a local authority chief exec that I found very interesting was, well, actually, it's not going to work unless we change the culture. And so we questioned and said, well, change the culture of what? And they said, well, although we have all of these different services that are working with the same people, they've each got slightly different cultures and slightly different focuses on outcomes. And in reality, to make a difference, we need to try and join up those cultures and the focus on outcomes. So I think that is going to probably be one of the first and possibly biggest challenges of the Health and Work Service, which is, if you get co-commissioning and co-design, if you start to get some local insight into it, how do you address the fact that actually at a local level you may have one team that has a very specific focus on housing, another team that has a very specific focus on a person's mental health. How do you bring that together to get a holistic sort of view of a person and the challenge of the service? And I think, having been involved in this for some time, really, to get something to work really effectively, that's the issue that you're going to need to address to make a service that gets proper innovation and collaboration working to deliver a service at local level.
Great. Thanks very much, Chris. Sarah?
Okay, so I'm going to build on what Chris said, really. So for those of you who've not heard of Collaborate, we're a social business set up 3 years ago by Lord Victor Adeboele, based just near the Elephant Castle, but operating all across the UK. And our role is really to build cross-sector collaboration in the delivery of services to the public. And we are sort of part think tank, but mainly do tank. We do practice-based work, often at a local level, commissioned by local authorities, health, third sector, private sector, to help build readiness to collaborate. So we talk a lot about readiness and we talk a lot about behaviours. So that would be our version of the culture. And I think our perspective on public service markets is they're a good thing, and the more that you can use the assets of the sectors and you can use competitive levers, that's good. What we find in terms of driving integration and collaboration, there are two worlds. There's the market world, and there's the sort of group of people who talk about systems change. And on the whole, they don't interact. There's this thing called systems theory, which is messy and complex and all about behaviours and all about people. And then there's things called market, which is all about hard levers and procurements and linear processes and doing certain things. You pull this lever and this set of things happen. And actually, you need both, and you need to locate the market within that wider focus of systems change. And I think there's a risk with some of the market thinking is you've sort of forgotten why we're doing it, and it's to drive that system change. So what we've done is a lot of work around the preconditions for system change. So what are the conditions in a place that will make that systems change more likely? What are the set of behaviours that people can exhibit and build as a cross-sector, cross-place? And a lot of that is around the assets of place. A lot of that is about focusing on outcomes, not institutions. So we've all talked about outcome-based commissioning for ever such a long time. But actually, we spend quite a lot of time over-designing the system, making it incredibly complicated, and therefore it's very hard to focus on a small number of outcomes. You've got to get the behaviours right. So we think of systems change as going through a sort of, not a cycle because these things are iterative, but think about vision and behaviours, then think about the infrastructure, the market being a key part of the infrastructure, make sure it drives through to delivery, and think about impact and learning, and that impact is with reference to citizen, not impact with reference to the organisation so much. How can this stack up in a place? Just a couple of examples really, one from Coventry and one from Birmingham. I don't only work in the West Midlands, those two places just happen to have come up. So in Coventry, they have redesigned their homelessness services, and they've used competition as a lever for that. They've used competition as a lever to integrate lots of different fragmented homelessness services. They've not done lots of complicated pay mechanisms. You're paid based on outcomes, yes. You're given a chunk of money up front with a reasonable degree of flexibility on how to spend it, and then they drive a focus from outcomes through that. The thing that they did was they spent a lot of time with the market engaging beforehand around the design of the specification. They involved users in that. They built trust between the commissioner and the provider. The sort of artificial division of commissioner and provider is dead, I think. You know, health and wellbeing boards increasingly having both on there. And so they really tried to break down those boundaries. For example, the case management system that tracks homeless people through the different types of preventative and reactive interventions is open to both commissioner and provider. So they can monitor exactly what's happening in a live state. There isn't this sense of, it's my information, we'll only share it in this way in a contract management meeting. There's a much more open relationship to how data is shared. And the contract is set up in a way that you can't pass the buck because they went for a prime contractor model with a very sophisticated supply chain that draws on all three sectors, but a prime contractor model. It means that actually there is no incentive in the system for Salvation Army, who were the successful bidder, to shunt a homeless person from one bit of the system to the other, because if they get discharged from this place without a house, they're still going to be the Salvation Army's problem when they end up on the streets. So the incentives work across the system. Similar thing in the sexual health pathway in Birmingham. So Public Health, Birmingham City Council, picked up a fragmented, okay set of services and needed to drive both cost reduction and improve outcomes, and used large scale, 100 million over 5 years, competitive tender to do that. The two big hospitals in the area bid. The successful one, University Hospital Birmingham, really saw this as an opportunity and were excited about the vision for integrated sexual health pathway. So preventing sexual health in the first place, and the incentives in the contract, meaning that it's in their interest for them not to end up in hospital, even though the payment tariff on hospital might make you think the reverse. So they've had to integrate across the supply chain, boots from the private sector, lots of third sector providers, lots of young people co-designing. But what's really made the difference is the public health officials in the city council were absolutely ruthless about sticking to 10 key outcomes. And any time anything deviated from 10 key outcomes, in terms of the narrative, in terms of the payback, in terms of the contract, they really drew it back to those 10 outcomes. And the words that the guy uses, he put the shoe leather in, he got the politicians on board, he got everyone in the system on board to those outcomes, so that when the behaviours and big providers who didn't win, who maybe could have gone bust because of the fallout from not winning in that area, and the politicians started to get wobbly, drew it back to the outcomes for the citizens of Birmingham, and tried to really keep it simple and focus. Both Coventry and Birmingham, big leap of faith, big risk taken by the Commissioner, and a climate which the Chief Exec of both of those organisations said, if this doesn't work, we'll learn from it, rather than just scrutinise and lambast. So I do think some of that is a lot easier to do at a local level, so Devolution, watch that space.
Great, thanks very much. Really interesting examples. And Richard?
I want to talk a little bit about some of the blockers to transforming public services. I think it is possible to incentivise integration and collaboration in public service markets. On the whole, behaviour follows the money, so the simple answer is to tie funding to outcomes. Outcomes for individuals, not necessarily for groups of individuals, not necessarily for localities, but to long-term social outcomes and well-being at an individual level. It isn't that difficult. However, we keep coming across, in the UK and elsewhere, some notable blockers, notable barriers to getting this done. And I want to tell you 4 brief examples of where I've seen these blockers in action. First one would be the work programme, which Chris has already referred to. So before the work programme was introduced, DWP spent about £1 billion on outsourced welfare to work provision that was combined to commission the work programme, with an intention, if the work programme hit its targets, of spending about 750 million, not £1 billion. In 2012-13, the work programme underspent by 248 million. This was clawed back by the Treasury at the end of the year, and it was seen as a big success. The work programme had saved cash in the year, but this was an outcome-funded contract. So 248 million of underspend meant 248 million fewer outcomes that would create a long-term greater expense in terms of both benefit spend and at a social individual well-being level. Financial management, budgeting and planning at a local and a national government level is hopelessly simplistic and short-term. I was speaking to someone not that long ago who runs a big business running homes for old people funded by local authorities. And about 5 years ago, the average stay of an old person in one of their homes was about 3 years. Right now, the average stay of someone in one of their homes is 3 months, because they are put into the home at the last minute, at the very last minute, to reduce spend, and in that 3-month period they then die. It's a perverse hidden consequence of the local austerity and its impact that we haven't actually seen or talked about. And it also, for me, is something about how budgets and services are siloised. Now, maybe this will be solved by some joint commissioning between health and adult social care. Maybe, if their budgets are also combined and attached to individual outcomes. If I stop a youth offending, will the police or the courts or the prisons recognise a saving? I suspect the police will want to go and spend that money somewhere else. Often the impact of these social outcomes is felt across all of these different service areas. Slough Children's Services has been put out to an independent children's trust, reporting directly to the Minister for Children, with sort of dotted line into Slough Local Authority, because of years of underperformance and a succession of Ofsted reports warning of difficulties there. For various reasons, I looked at their financial reports, expecting in a failing children's service area to see a lack of spending. And most of these frontline services are not rocket science. Mostly it's about the size of the caseload that the frontline worker is working with. So I expected to see in Slough Children's Services each social worker with a big caseload. 75, 80 kids at any one time. They were working with 13 children at any one time. And we're still a failing children's service area. There is something strange, a perverse consequence of rigid professionalism. So that I think what was going on was that only about a third of the time of the social worker was working with the young people, and the rest of their time was spent in administration, bureaucracy and supervision. Professional services, professional processes intended to standardise can squeeze out responsiveness to individual need. My last example, from a slightly different angle here, when the housing benefit changes were being introduced, Brent Council worked out that there were more families at risk of homelessness in Brent as a result of the benefit changes than Birmingham and Manchester combined, because of where Brent sits on the edge of London and the level of the rents and the level of deprivation in families in the borough. So they sent out 1,000 letters to these families saying, you need to phone this number, you're going to be made homeless or shipped to Stoke-on-Trent or North Wales. Phone this number and we can help you try and work through this. 1,000 letters went out, 10 people responded. It was a brown envelope. First thing you do with a brown envelope is put it in the bin. If you open it, you don't understand it. It's part of a cacophony of noise directed at you, and the more you sit in deprivation, the more of noise there is coming from different services, all in competition for your attention. So, 4 things. The budgeting and the financial management is not fit for purpose. Services are funded and delivered in silos. Professional processes perversely preclude a focus on real impact. And unsurprisingly, service users are alienated and social exclusion is exacerbated by the way the services are delivered. And I would just add a further one, which is stop thinking that a market means price competition. This is a nonsense. It is a dogma in the way that we are commissioning this stuff in the UK that we don't necessarily see anywhere else. The Australians outsource all of their employment services with no price competition. They compete on the basis of impact, not cost. So what do we need? I think actually you have to separate out the interests and the duties between the commissioner, a prime contractor and a provider. You've got to separate these out. You've got to get rid of these conflicts of interest that exist. At a purse string level, we need a very thin commissioner who is defining what the social outcome is, the social impact that is being commissioned. We then need a prime contractor who is raising funding, who is raising social investment, who is designing the service and putting in place a network of provision. The prime contractor can't provide. They then must have a subcontracted layer of providers. It would mean a much slimmer local and national government. And that probably brings me to my concluding comment, which is the biggest blocker of all. Whenever I have this conversation, anywhere in the world, about transforming the impact of public services, we meet one enormous blocker, and that is we are asking the turkey to vote for Christmas. We're asking the public services to give up their control over the service and over the individual. And this is true of the providers as well, who are deeply conflicted. Whether they are Serco or Action for Children, they are conflicted because they cannot bite the hand that feeds them, that being the commissioner. If we're really going to get this to work, and SIBs at the moment are playing around the edges, if you are really going to get it to work, you have got to have high-level, big political buy-in. That's where it's got to be driven. Because otherwise, I think these blockers will ensure we continue in precisely the same course as always.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Richard, and for all of you for such provocative and interesting examples as well. So I'm going to take the chair's prerogative to ask the first question to the panel, which is we recently published our pre-spending review report, Managing with Less, and in that we called for much more central coordination across government in overseeing public service markets and particularly in helping to sort of share learning across and between departments. So how do you all think that we can get new models like some of the ones that you've been outlining adopted more widely across Whitehall and across local government so we actually see more systemic change? Do you want to kick off, Sarah?
I would start with the local rather than the national. That's sort of my answer to any question, so I'll use it once. But actually, I think there's a risk in when things are driven from the national, that is the stamp that's put on them, and it's then very hard to take it up, because actually how Birmingham ran their procurement for sexual health and how Coventry ran their procurement for homelessness were different, because they were based on the assets and the skills and the journey that they've been to, and their readiness to use that set of market levers is different from somewhere else who aren't ready yet, and therefore if you just chuck in the Better Care Fund, it can act like a nuclear bomb, whereas somewhere else it will work. So I think there's something about National playing more of a convening role to let this stuff filter up and then disseminate and put it back, rather than saying, here's the framework, you've got to follow it this way, and it's A, linear, and B, will work the same way in every place.
Mm-hmm. Christine?
Well, I mean, there are sort of activities like Crown Commercial Service and Major Projects Authority that are meant to be sort of policing this, and I guess what I come down to is always, what do you incentivize for? And that's how do you know, that's what you get at the end of the day to, I think one of Richard's comments about, you know, you will play to commissioners. So actually, what are we incentivizing people for? What are we incentivizing that procurement person on the ground? Are we incentivizing them to take that risk with a new provider? And, you know, actually, is that kind of risk reward payoff there? And I don't think that balance is right at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Chris?
I think one of the things that you could do is actually redefine, if you want to have that central role, because I think the lack of clarity is a big issue here. So actually everybody wants to get down into the detail and overly specify everything. So actually, if you wanted to have a national role in something, then I would say keep it very, very simple and focus on very few things. So we've talked a lot about outcomes today. If we use the employment sector as an example, so if you get devolution and lots of places are going to start to commission their own employment services, then I actually think one thing that would be really helpful to do at a national level is actually set a single metric or set of metrics. Because the big risk I see happening is we're just going to recreate the wheel 55 times or however many times it is, and then actually you're going to have every area in the country saying our programme is the best because we got X% into work, and then somebody else will go, well, we got X% into work, and then you look at it and you realise that they're measuring it a little bit differently. So if you had a very simple wraparound that actually said, if it's employment services, this is the measure that you use. It's a standardised measure. How you commission the service, how you design the service, who delivers it, that's up to you at a local level. But actually, this is the national metric that we'll use for everybody so that we can enable that measurement across the piece. I think that would be very helpful.
Great. Richard?
The silos start in Whitehall. I think the structure of Whitehall is probably not fit for purpose, I'm afraid. And we probably need to consider the cross-cutting themes that we would like to see as social outcomes, such as employment. So that the activity, the commissioning activity of any government department should be put through some sort of filter to assess its impact on employment or unemployment. There have been some good attempts clearly to start to develop some sort of centre of excellence of commissioning in the Cabinet Office. One of my big concerns in the whole localisation agenda is that we see a lack of expertise in commissioning at a central level. If we multiply that 55 times, where we're probably paying those people at a local level half what we're paying the person in the centre, the level of expertise could well be even less. And the Centre of Excellence for Commissioning that I see in the Cabinet Office, I'm afraid, is probably more to do with being a Centre of Excellence in procurement than in commissioning. And procuring paperclips is not the same as commissioning long-term social outcomes. The whole of the transforming rehabilitation thing was screwed up for the social investment sector because there was an insistence at the last minute on having big guarantees, big bank guarantees from somebody, which precluded social investors from taking part. And I think that had come out of the Cabinet Office. And then, this is a generally unpopular thing to say, but I think localisation is a bit of a distraction, and we must be really careful of it. What is important is experience at the level of the individual. Now, of course, that individual lives within a local context, but they're not necessarily defined by it. And the individual in that flat, in that housing estate, has a completely different set of issues to the individual living in the flat next to them. Let's be careful about ring fencing and boxing up all of our responses at the level of locality, because that's how our systems are currently structured.
Great, thank you very much. I'd now like to open it up to the floor. We do have some roving microphones, so please wait for the microphone when you want to ask your question and say your name and organisation and keep your comments brief. And if you are in the room next door, please do come in if you'd like to ask a question. So who would like to kick us off? Got one here, please.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for excellent presentations. My name's Adam Sharples. I used to work in DWP, had some responsibility for commissioning employment programs, and now on the other side of the fence, but do a bit of commissioning in the health service as a member of a clinical commissioning group. My question is about how big or small is local, because if a big theme is emerging that we want more decentralisation, more localisation, more devolution of decision making, what is the right level to devolve to? Birmingham might work, it seems to me. Manchester might work, it seems to me. London doesn't work, and the boroughs are too small, the mayor's level is too big. So what is the right level to devolve to?
Do you want to kick off,
Yeah.
Sarah?
For me, it depends. Yeah, it depends on the place and depends on what you're commissioning. So we're Collaborate and NLGN are currently running a commission on place-based health, and we've been looking at 4 areas. Birmingham, one of them, which is where the sexual health example came from. Suffolk, Sunderland, and London Borough of Sutton. So covering some of the different geographies, and what we might need to catalyse change in health outcomes. I'm talking health, not healthcare here. In Suffolk, when they talk about local, they're very much at the community level. They're because of the large geography, but dispersed population. You're talking Sudbury. You're not talking West Suffolk. So, West Suffolk CCG is the CCG commissioning area, but Sudbury is the place that people would identify with. They would be registered with the GP at, and that sort of thing. That, I think, means that how you might devolve in Suffolk would look very different from how you will devolve in Birmingham, where there is a greater identity with the city, notwithstanding Richard's completely valid point about individuals. Where we're seeing the interesting work happening is where, we take Sunderland, for example, they are shifting from gathering data on what happens where, which is good, and they've got cross-sector, cross-organisational data, so that's a step forward than a lot of places, to starting to build insight into why it happens. So the difference between knowing that this is where most dog fouling happens to the insight, which is actually just because the dog fouling happens there doesn't mean the dogs live there. They could be being walked in from another place, actually doing a much more of the behavioural insights, observation, and getting a different set of data. I think building that insight is a critical first step to answering your question, which will be different in different places, depending on what that insight tells you.
Does anyone else want to pick up on that?
Adam, nice to see you. Hi. I think the answer is probably that the right size is different depending on which part of the supply chain you're talking about, whether you're talking about the commissioner or the prime contractor or the provider. It's not about geographical size, it's not necessarily about population size. Manchester and Birmingham might feel okay and London not, but the Scottish would tell you they're a perfect size for it, potentially. Some of the difference there may be around unitary authority as opposed to multiple authority, so existing structure. But actually I think it is about being fit for purpose at where you are in this chain. In terms of the delivery to the individual, I would suggest it's really quite small, particularly if you're talking about individuals with complex needs. It's very small. But at the level of defining the high-level commissioning purpose, I would suggest that actually is national.
Can I just pick up on that actually and ask what you think the role that citizens and the public should be in designing and commissioning public services locally? As we're seeing kind of devolution to particular areas and groups of combined authorities and so on, what role should the public play in that?
I mean, I think it's they have a huge role to play in this, and that is precisely what the Interserve Cat22, this public service lab that they're setting up, is all about. It's actually how do you get the voice and input of the service user in a centralized way from the delivery standpoint to then make it more applicable across, because it is about, you know, we have to do more for less. It's about the, you know, people doing more for themselves, and actually you need to get their buy-in and take them along that journey to do that.
A New Deal for Communities possibly offer a salutary lesson in relation to this. A big initiative to put big money into sink estates to stop them sinking. I can't remember the time frame of the New Deal for Communities, but we're talking sort of 1999, 2000. And the approach is go to the community and say, we have 100, 200 million to spend here. What should we spend it on? And they all say, I want a new house, please. And that's where it stops. So, of course, you can't deliver a service to an excluded individual unless you listen and empower that individual, but be careful about the engagement of that individual in a much larger commissioning conversation.
Yeah, I think for us it's about how you catalyse a different role for the citizen it's much more, it's not consultation, it's not just co-production, and it's much more about, after the contract award, how are those services mobilised in a way that uses the assets of the individuals in a place to help deliver and benefit from those services. So some of the stuff that Lambeth are doing are about building much more resilient communities through a variety of social action methods, are seeing benefits to outcomes that aren't the direct ones that were intended through the social action, but they have that wider purpose. So the risk is that co-production sort of become this thing, and you say you've put a bit of that in the spec and a bit of that in the bid. That's neither here nor there. It's how you use the assets in the delivery that is the important bit.
In relation to this question and also the previous question, I think the delivery of services to the public, and I'm not just talking about public services, but services overall, has gone through a massive change in the last 10 to 15 years. And I actually think for all of this conversation, we haven't really talked about technology and how that's changing services. And so my reflection on Adam's question, so what's the right level to commission? I think there's a real risk you go down smaller and smaller and smaller. And you know, one of the provocations that I always do if I go to a room full of people who are in favour of devolution is I ask for people who've got an iPhone to get out their iPhone and to hold it up. And then I ask, you know, where are you from? Well, you're from Liverpool, you're from Newcastle. So how is a Newcastle iPhone different from a Liverpool iPhone? And actually, we're in a world where things are becoming increasingly standardized, not just in terms of products, but in terms of websites that people access, not just for information, but also to start to, you know, get your daily shopping. But I actually think there's a clue there. So if you think about your local shop, if you go back 40, 50 years ago, people went to their local grocer. And then you got the advent of supermarkets, and they were, you know, they all of a sudden got much bigger, but they were standardized, but it was still in the local area. And now actually you've got a website that anyone in the country could go into a single website, but actually their service that they get, because of the data that sits behind it, is very personalized to them. And so things are possibly designed on a much bigger scale, but then the wraparound for an individual in terms of what services they get or access or products they buy, there's very intelligent stuff underneath that says, actually, well, this person fits this profile, and therefore we're going to make sure that we show them these things. Now, obviously, the most relevant example here is retail, but I do think that actually in public services, there is something about the data insight that you get and the behaviour of people. And in terms of co-design, I don't think co-design should be something that happens up front. Again, learning the lesson from what's going on in the world of technology, co-design should be something that happens once the service is running, and it's people's ability to give feedback, to take their business elsewhere, to give a thumbs up, to give a thumbs down, so that you get a very dynamic shaping of the service. And again, I think technology offers a lot of clues on how we might revolutionise public services in that way as we go forward.
It's interesting to go back to the IFG question about the role that you could play, because I think think drawing on some of the stuff that Nesta have been saying recently about the macro and the micro, and how you take that macro view, which is everything's the same, but at the micro view, which is at the individual level. And so what's the IFG or other people's role in sort of converging the macro with the micro? Because that's the place that's really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
We had a question over here and then one at the back over there.
Yeah, just quite interested that we're not really talking about markets, we're talking about public services and public service delivery. And so two kind of linked questions, and they come back to some of the market mechanism. Why have we got markets in the first place? One of the issues is competition. Two of the words up there, competition actually maybe doesn't sit very easily with, at the very, putting it mildly, in terms of integration and collaboration. So I'm just interested about what the role is for competition in these new markets. Is it competition for markets? Is it competition within markets? Because you can have a competition for a tender, but once the contract's there, then how do you drive performance? Competition is clearly one of the mechanisms you use. From the other point of view, we've talked a lot about service user in this. I'm surprised nobody's mentioned individual budgets as one of the ways in which people can be empowered and engaged in a way that they're not at the moment. And certainly from the employment services field, it seems to be completely outside the agenda at the moment, which I think is a great miss, frankly.
Dan, can you say your name and organisation as well?
Okay, Dan Thin from the University of Portsmouth.
Thank you. Who would like to pick up on that before we take the question at the back?
I'll just quickly, on your point around competition in markets and retaining that competition in delivery as well, there is a reform report, actually, sorry, but that was published around creating competition in markets, and actually the fact that there is no other, in the commercial sector, a sort of market where you appoint a monopoly and then have that person sit there for 5 to 7 years. It's actually, how do you continue that kind of competition throughout delivery as well to make sure that you can just chop and change and replace that provider if they're underperforming. On the point around personal budgets, and this was actually one of the things around kind of the question around how local is local, but we are seeing a model. We've invested into an organisation called Derek, which is all about having that person choice around personal budgets and them commissioning their services, this is for elderly people, their social care services, and actually giving them an option around, rather than paying £7.50 for that private care provider, £15 for an hour for that private care provider, could they get a volunteer in from the community to supplement that, to actually create take them out to the pub for a beer or something, instead of that sort of very light touch approach of a professional care provider, and do they get a better package of support as a result? And it is about that sort of personal choice.
Did anyone else want to pick up on Dan's point?
Just briefly, I mean, I think the notion that competition is sort of anti-collaboration needs to be really challenged, I think. I absolutely get that on surface level, because if you compete, there's this sort of, but it goes back to that false provider commissioner and lack of trust distinction. The two examples I used, it was only because of competition that service, that wholesale service design, that level of savings and that improved set of outcomes was delivered. And yet, in lots of areas around the country, they're not even prepared to consider competition because they think it will be anti-collaborative. And yet it was exactly competition that forced a level of collaboration. You then had to take the collaboration seriously and build it. You can't just force it with market levers, but you needed that catalyst to get a complete redesign. We do a lot of work on demand management, demand shaping techniques, and actually the only way often to get that whole-scale shift from reactive to preventive services is through competition, to do it at pace and scale. So I think we need to be challenging that more robustly.
I think you could have competition and selection of prime contractor. So if the commissioner is defining a big social outcome and you compete to choose your prime contractor, then for the prime contractor to deliver that through their subcontractors, they're going to have to get those subcontractors to collaborate.
Yeah.
Because of the complex needs of the individuals I'm presuming we're talking about. In terms of then how to drive performance, Dan, we need to have clever contract and performance management, which we rarely see. And the first and biggest tool in that is transparency over performance, which we have seen virtually none of in employment service delivery through the work programme. And it is a chronic failing and means we cannot hold providers, contractors to account. In terms of individual budgets, I'm yet to come across a model that works in terms of individualising the budget for a long-term unemployed person. So there are some interesting models in South America, I think, where they look at combining in some way unemployment benefit and pensions so that you have a pot that you can draw on during your life or not. But I'm really talking about the people who are falling through and landing into some sort of safety net, for whom that isn't necessarily going to be appropriate, and that we're still going to want to choose to step in as a society to provide them with additional support, because leaving them where they are represents such a cost to them and to society as a whole. And I don't think I've not seen an individualised budget working in that context.
Great, thank you. We had a question at the back.
Hi, I'm Sam Windett from URSA, representing the employment support sector. I'm interested in this thought of government as a convener, and also, Richard, your point about cross-government objective and employment being a good one. Of course, that was what the work programme always started life as. It was a framework for everything else to plug into. It was never intended to have all of the money in it just from DWP. So I think it's interesting to go back to that idea. I understand that local could provide a dimension to do that. I understand that, but are we really moving into that era now where each department is interpreting employment in its own way? I'm thinking particularly biz and the 3 million apprenticeships. And how do we ensure that people aren't falling through the gaps between those big different government interpretations?
Who'd like to pick that up? Sarah.
Thanks, Sam. Hello. Sam and I bid together as part of transforming rehabilitation. That's another saga. I've done well not to mention that too much today. So government as a convener. So this is particularly building on the work we're doing around place-based health. What we're seeing is really good stuff happening in some pockets of locality, and the question is, how do you scale, learn across, and going back to some of the points you made. The conversation that we started to have with NHS England is one around a recognition that this stuff does happen in different places at different paces, and some of that from the observation of how the Better Care Fund has landed in different places. Some places they've grabbed it and said this is exactly the kit we need, it came at the right point and it's forced us to a level of ambition. Other places it's taken fragile relationships and turned people against each other. Same thing, just how it landed in different places. So what they were saying was, is there a role? And the question I put to them was, who? If the National Audit Office wanted to hold this person to account, who would they sit in the chair at the PAC? But who would actually convene this, taking the best from the local, but not just sort of sharing it and learning from each other. But he likened it to the idea of recipe cards. So if there are some things that we know work in across health and social care, sticking with that example, how can we as a national say, well, actually, these are the broad ingredients, and this is what the sort of recipe looks like, but we completely accept the fact that Sunderland's chef will be different from Suffolk's chef, and you might, replace pine nuts for walnuts, and, there's a level, but that actual, what is the basic framework? But not a group of clever people in Whitehall sitting thinking what that framework should be, but convening in a way that draws those examples together, creates that recipe card or set of recipe cards, pushing the analogy now, and then and pushes it out there for people to apply differently in different places.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to pick up on that?
Single biggest issue in relation to employment and unemployment in the UK is the persistent gulf between our employment systems and our skills systems. We create a commission for employment and skills, or Gordon Brown does back when. It still exists. It costs £65 million a year. We have a persistent gulf between employment and skills. It doesn't do anything to bring those two together. And I think it goes back to the first thing I said, which is behaviour follows the money. You've got to put the cash together, and you've got to say, I am now paying for a long-term outcome for this individual, which is about employment and progression in employment. And I'm giving you This is my commissioner says this. I'm now giving through a prime contractor all of my employment systems and my skills systems as well. Further education. There are more people in Greater Manchester studying beauty and hair than there are in jobs of beauty and hair in Greater Manchester. So you've got more people studying it than are actually employed in the jobs. Implying what, 100% turnover every year? Got to bring these two things together, which means putting the cash together and tying it, as I say, I think, to long-term progression outcomes.
And I think there's some really interesting questions there around the devolution deal process as parts of the adult skills system are being devolved in devolution deals and how that's going to affect the kind of integration of employment and skills at a local level.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to speak to, we were calling for and have got a smaller amount than we'd hoped, but in the spending review, an outcomes fund, which is going to be delivered by Cabinet Office, but that's precisely to the point of the fact that there are different, so it's breaking down the silos between the different departments to actually achieve focus on the individual. For example, a person with mental health conditions, what does that actually mean? What's the package of support that needs to be delivered to that individual?
The problem, Christine, is if it is too small.
It is quite small.
So employment zones, back in 2000, I ran one in Brent. One of the objectives of the employment zone was it would act as a magnet for other services. And the budget in Brent for long-term unemployed people through this outsourced contract was £5 million a year or so. It wasn't big enough. It wasn't big enough to get the attention of skills or health or social care because they were quite happy with what they had. Thank you very much. We don't need you.
Yeah. No, so it's how do we actually make that relevant, that top-up outcome amount relevant for completely. Yeah.
We had a question there, and then there, and then there. So just starting with you. Thanks.
Thanks. Tina Licky from the Behavioural Insights team. Just interested in the specific question of improving services and trialling and testing what works best. How can we use commissioning to do more of that?
Would you like to pick up on that?
I think part of the problem that we have at the moment is that once something's commissioned, then it's set in stone. So it actually runs completely counter to moving things as they go along and doing what you've suggested in terms of trialling. So I think there's a complete mindset change that needs to happen, which is actually you almost need to build the space in for services to be tested and trialled. I think a big cultural issue that we have across public services in this country is nothing's allowed to fail. And because nothing's allowed to fail, then you can never actually learn from your failures, and that's how you improve things. You test things, you see does it work or does it not work. Everything, so much is invested now, every initiative has to work. And so it's only ever acknowledged that it fails if it really fails very, very badly. And that's not how services improve or progress. You get lots of small-scale failures. Plan A was going to achieve this. Actually, Plan A didn't work. Why did it not work? How do we do? Is it Plan B? And so I think until you can find a way to build contracts that allow a degree of failure and to allow a degree of movement in terms of how services are delivered, then you're not going to get that. Sounds a bit pessimistic, I'm sorry.
I think you should just stop doing it. You should stop trying to decide what the answer is. You should simply be trying to say what you are looking for in terms of the long-term social outcome. And then commissioning somebody to deliver that for you, and it's up to them to test and to innovate. One of the things that you will do is, for example, the Discovery Weeks. They started off in Edinburgh and in Haringey, and it was a programme to work with lone parents. It was a 2-week programme. It was individualised budgets, Dan, sort of. They took the lone parents at the beginning of the 2 weeks to this group of them. They said, here is a facilitator. They've got a fund of £1,000. You can do whatever you want with it, as long as it's legal. You plan your 2 weeks. You decide what's going to happen. Our objective is to get you into a job or into training, but you decide what you're doing. And they planned picnics to the zoo. They brought in someone to do their makeup. They did all sorts of stuff. Job Centre Plus looked at this, Employment Service as was, and said this is a fantastic programme, it's working brilliantly. 85–90% of these lone parents are leaving Discovery Weeks and going off into employment or training. We must roll it out across the country. And they did. And it failed completely. Because what they did was they said, you're coming on a 2-week programme, And what you're going to do is, you're going to organise a picnic at the zoo, then you're going to bring in someone to do your makeup, and we will systematise it. That's what you want to do once you've learnt your lesson, is systematise it across everywhere, rather than standing back and going, I want to buy lone parents into jobs, good jobs, that they stay in. Now let somebody else test, trial, individualise it, and keep learning and adapting it in order to keep giving me my outcomes.
Okay, we had a question just next to you.
Hi, Natasha Thomas from Brands to Life. A question for the panel on the back of Richard's comment about trying to communicate with hard-to-reach groups with brown envelopes. You know, how can we improve the way we communicate with people and get them to be more engaged with the services we provide?
What we did in Brent in response to the brown envelope failure to respond was we introduced a team of what we called service navigators, who were designed to sit outside of all of the services and accost the person in pyjamas at the school gate who was dropping off their children and talk to them about which service doors they should be knocking on and helping them through that door and advocating. It was terribly difficult to stop the service navigators being sucked in. But it shouldn't be that difficult. I was in Southwark with a charity there one day who pointed across the road to this housing estate and said there are 120 kids on that estate who have been born to young mothers. And 20 young men are responsible for all of them. And we all know who they are. But if you all know who they are, why the bloody hell are these 20 young men walking around doing this still? How difficult is it for you to join yourselves up and effectively put a 24-hour mentor with each one of those young men? So it's a person walking.
So we increasingly, as part of what we do, but not on its own, deploy behavioural insights people, so nudge, etc. And what you're seeing more locally is people being recruited into teams with that skill set. So it's sort of shifting from just a sort of fad to, oh, let's get a little bit of that, because when we can design our form so that it looks a little bit different and we all tick the right box, to actually starting to, so in Sunderland, observing why it is that people drive their kids to school rather than walk them to school, and doing some sort of, not just asking them, but observing different behaviours at different times and embedding a behaviouralist researcher into the data team, because actually that harder data and that softer data, and translating the soft data into hard data, then means that you have a different conversation. So that's certainly an element of what we've been doing.
Mm-hmm. And there was a question just in front of you.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Teamster from the Salvation Army, so thank you very much for name-checking us with the Coventry example. I think for us that's an exciting project, and it's our first opportunity as well to see what actually happens to people when they leave our services. Because quite often you provide a part of the journey but not all of it, and therefore it's really hard for you to actually identify what works in the long run, what are the impacts rather than the immediate inputs and outcomes that we produce when people are with us and when they leave us quite shortly after. We usually lose track of them. I think there's a similar problem in employment services, despite the lengthier program now with work program. So particularly when we're moving to only offering services to hardest to help, how will we know what works, what doesn't work, what happens to those people later on? If you've got any ideas sort of how we can join that part of it up better.
Chris?
I think a lot of it goes back down to data. So unfortunately, I think public services run 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years behind the curve in terms of utilising up-to-date technology, practices in terms of data analytics. But I think that's the answer, because without the data, you can't. It would be incredibly expensive to try and track somebody all that way through. If you're having to, and it's very difficult to keep track of people. But I think if you can have much better systems to capture data on what happens, what works, what doesn't, then I think that's part of the answer.
I completely agree with Chris's point, because there's, it seems crazy coming from the outside, but there was a provider that we were talking to who delivers both work program and delivers OLAS in prisons for, prisoner education. And they couldn't, because of the sort of information sort of security and dichotomy across the government departments, they couldn't, even though they've worked with that individual, know all that sort of stuff, have this case file on that individual in prisons, they couldn't then refer that individual to their welfare to work provider who, their work program sort of provider to say, look, this is all the stuff that we have on this individual. This is what they need. We know these 3 things. We've worked with them for, however long, and this is, we already know. You don't have to do that sort of groundwork. And so there's a lot around that data point that is absolutely critical. And I don't know.
And just to build on that, the data, but in Richard's language, for today's world, so the digital data. So the smart places are employing data scientists straight out of university who frankly know nothing about public services, but what they do know about is how people operate online, how to use data differently, and creating that sort of richer picture of what that data means. That we've got quite a traditional view with what counts as data and what you could use data for. That's not to say there aren't still massive barriers around data sharing. If you've not done that one yet, you definitely need to. But I think, we have quite a traditional notion of data, and actually the kids coming out of university now, I'm showing my age, very different ways in which that data can be used to achieve the outcomes.
It might be that at central government level you're wrong to attempt some sort of big brother following of each individual through their different cycles of their life, and that you could be measuring and commissioning at the level of higher level social and economic metrics, so that in that area you're measuring at the level of employment, unemployment, earnings, taxation, utilisation of health services, what sort of health services are being utilised, and so on, which would give you a good view at that locality, whatever size it is, of economic and well-being. And underneath that, you are commissioning then, your commissioned prime and subcontractors are working down to the level of individuals.
I think data sharing and data access is a very thorny issue. And so all of us in this room, we're all members of the public, we all have our data in various different databases, and we all get very nervous about the idea of an organisation maybe sharing our data with a different organisation. It's a real and very thorny issue. I think my view of this is actually, when you look at the language that's used, you have data owners. So if you're a government department, you could be a data owner, you could be a data controller. If you're a contractor, you could potentially get given responsibility as a data controller. I actually don't think these issues are surmountable in terms of across public services unless you turn the whole system on the head. I think unless the individual becomes the data owner and the data controller, you're never actually going to be able to circumvent and move these things, because actually it's conversations happening between departments and shadowy, from the perspective of the individual, who are these organisations who I don't even know they're sharing my data, but actually if you make an individual their data controller and data owner, and as they transverse their way through public services, they can make a decision that says, well, actually, I'm here, I'm going to allow these people access to my data, and therefore they can see, how much I'm willing to share, or they can see the whole journey, because I'm making an active choice. I think that's the only way that you're actually going to, because it's just going to get a bigger and bigger challenge, and it's not just in the UK, it's every single country, and it's for good reason, because it's our data, and it's a big issue, it being shared without our permission.
Yeah. We published a report earlier in November on joining up public services at a local level. We identified 59 different attempts by government to do this since 1997, many of which we've mentioned on the panel today. And it won't surprise you to hear that data sharing was one of the key findings that we had in the paper that went alongside that.
I think Chris is absolutely exactly what our Health Commission is also saying. The individual has to own the data, and until you can do that, I mean, which fits with some of the other things about individual empowerment and things like that as well. But you need to change the system first, because actually the lead time then to see the benefits while people get used to it is going to take a while.
We've got time just for a couple more questions before we wrap it up. Would anyone like to make some final questions or comments? we covered all the issues about how to collaborate and integrate services. Any final thoughts? There's one at the back there, and then one from Adam.
Hello, Alec Cameron from Socia Limited. Just wondered if you had any comments on the capacity of the market to deliver the collaborative services that you really want to make. There are always good examples of these things which pop up in various parts of the country in particular places, and you've talked about the risk of transferring, you know, lessons in a simplistic way from one to another. But do you have any view on how you build the market in order to be able to deliver this?
So for me, it'd be all about building the individual's capacity to collaborate. So what happens is it's public servants, either a national or local level, managing a lot of this. They've all gone through a career which has taught them about project management, and then about contract management, and then maybe about change management, and then maybe about leadership, but a version of leadership that is not collaborative. And actually, the people who are often in the market bit of this are the more linear of the groups. They like a process and they want to follow it, they want a checklist, they want a toolbox, and therefore the stuff that I was talking about before around systems change, this messy, relationship-driven stuff, they're very uncomfortable with that. And we need to find a way to bring a blended system, because you still need a structure, you still need a process, you still got to run a competition, but you need that pragmatism, ability to be comfortable with the uncomfortable, and for it to be a bit messy. The outcome focus is the way I think you can bring those two disciplines together, but it will, you know, we talk about building readiness to collaborate. You can't just sort of say, here's a set of outcomes, now you who are processy and you who are systemsy, just focus on that. You've actually got to spend the time building that readiness.
Yeah. And actually the third event in this event series that we're holding on the 25th of January is going to focus precisely on that issue, what kind of capacity and skills we need at central government and local government when we are designing, commissioning, stewarding public service markets. So Adam's question, then we'll have some final thoughts from the panel.
Thanks very much. Sorry to be greedy on the questions. It's actually more of a comment, really. The work programme has come up a few times, often in a slightly negative context. And I just think it would be really unfortunate if, as we think about the future of public service commissioning, we ended up putting the work programme into the box of, you know, things to avoid. Three particular points which have come up, which I just think are not right. First, the accusation that there was underspend in the first couple of years, and this was wasted by going back to the Treasury. What was the alternative? That we paid nearly £300 million to providers who had failed to deliver the outcome. To be honest, I think that would have been completely unacceptable. And actually that was a positive feature of the design, that it was heavily focused on outcomes. Secondly, the point has been made, Richard, you made the point that when we think about commissioning, we should really focus on simple outcomes and not over-specify the routes through which they were delivered. And that is precisely what the work programme did. I think actually rather successfully. Simple outcome, get a sustained job for people who've been having trouble finding work. That was the only outcome that mattered. So there was a simplicity there that I think was valuable. And then thirdly, the accusation that it failed the hardest to help. I think there's something in that, but we have to remember that that group which has had poor results from the work programme has had poor results from every other single programme that has been run by government. People with disabilities have not had better results from any of the programmes that have been run. Now that is a real challenge, but not one which I think is solved by attributing the failure specifically to the work programme.
I guess I'm the panellist who's directly involved with the work programme currently. I think you're right, absolutely right there, Adam, actually. And I think my observation, and I'm a bit philosophical about this at this point, but my observation is that there's a big gulf between reality and perception. And the reality of the work programme is that it's achieved the highest performance ever in the UK of an employment programme at a price which is 60, 70% lower than what government paid historically. But unfortunately, it's perceived to be a failure, and I think, you know, that's had a bigger impact in terms of whether that model might be adapted in the future. And so it's been an interesting experience. I once was on a Whiteall industry group learning set, and somebody who was far more seasoned than me sort of talked about his experience in public services and public sector markets, and he said, you know, often when the service gets to the point where it's delivering the best outcomes at the cheapest price is generally when it will swing against it, and you know, everything gets thrown out, and I suspect that we may have reached that stage of the work programme.
I just one comment, and Adam and I have had this conversation before. There is much in the design of the work programme which I think is strong. I think the key lesson to take away from the work programme, and this is across all commissioning, is that the commissioner needs commercial nous. The commissioner needs to have a view of what it is likely to cost to deliver something. Not in fine detail necessarily, because I am arguing that this is passed on, but needs to have a sense of what it is likely to cost to achieve something, so that if someone comes along and says, hey, I can do it for 40% less, they're probably having you on, unless they've got a really, really clever technological solution that they're also presenting at the same time. So the commissioner needs to have that commercial nous on their side as well, because those contractors are incentivized to win contracts, and they'll do whatever they can to win those bids.
I'm going to ask each of you just to, if you have any final thoughts, but also to answer the question, what's the one thing that you think we should do collectively to get more collaboration in public service markets? I'm going to pick on you first, Sarah.
Focus on behaviours.
Okay.
People, human behaviours. The behaviours of the people who are receiving the services and the behaviour of the people commissioning and providing.
Great.
It's all about behaviours.
Thanks.
And I'm going to pick up on point, but it is all around what is the shared language, what's the commonality, and it is around that sort of outcomes-based commissioning, and it's come up a couple of times on this panel, but I think that absolutely is. Bring everyone back to that conversation around which everyone is incentivised, the outcomes at the end of the day.
Great.
I think transparency of performance data, because I actually think that drives both competition and collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
Without that transparency, you don't really have the question of, well, what are they doing? Can we ask them? Can we try and find out? So I think much more transparent data.
Mm-hmm. And we've been doing some work on that here at the Institute, so glad to hear that, Richard.
What they said, and thinking about this separation of duties, trying to get some of these conflicts of interest out of the system. Commissioner, a prime contractor role and a subcontractor provider.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all very much indeed, and thank you for coming along. I just also would like to thank the Business Services Association for partnering with us on this event series, and to remind you that the third event is on the 25th of January, focusing on that capacity issue we started talking about. So please can you join me in thanking our panellists.